When we checked into that remote mountain hotel, I thought the worst thing that could happen was the outdated decor or a cold shower. But then the receptionist looked up, apologetic, and said there'd been a mistake with the booking. One room short. One bed short. My husband had just stepped out to take a call. My voice came out before I could stop it. It's fine. We'll manage. I smiled politely. I lied. Because when I turned to see who I'd be sharing a bed with, my heart sank. It was him. The man I was never supposed to see that way. The man I'd helped raise like a brother, or so I told myself. The man whose presence in a confined space would unravel everything I'd worked so hard to build. I could have said no. I could have insisted. But I didn't. I watched him place his bag near mine, like it was the most normal thing in the world. That night, when I lay on my side, inches from a boundary I wasn't sure I could keep, I felt the bed shift with his breath. And that was the moment I realized, this trip wasn't going to be about sightseeing. It was going to be about self-control. Or the lack of it. But let me tell you everything. Because the truth? It's messier than you think. And before I explain how everything spiraled into something I couldn't undo, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? And have you ever been so close to breaking the rules that even silence felt dangerous? I never liked surprises. I liked things planned neatly, safely, predictably. Our family trip to the mountains was supposed to be just that, structured, filled with familiar patterns. My husband booked the hotel weeks in advance. It was meant to be peaceful, simple. Nature walks, shared meals, old jokes repeated like traditions. But the moment we arrived and the receptionist told us there'd been a mistake with the rooms, I felt something in me shift. She said it apologetically, they'd accidentally overbooked. There weren't enough rooms for all of us to have our own. My husband looked annoyed. He immediately offered to switch and stay with his parents, leaving me with the only option that remained, sharing with my stepbrother. He wasn't my blood, but he had been in my life long enough to carry a sense of off-limits. And yet, something inside me, a buried curiosity, a foolish recklessness, whispered, let it be. I remember the first time he and I were alone in that room. It was small, the walls creaked slightly when the wind passed outside. There was only one bed, freshly made with 2 sets of folded towels at the foot. I busied myself with unpacking, but my hands moved too quickly, nervously. He placed his bag in the corner and took out a book. Just a book. He didn't say much. Neither did I. Dinner that night was with the family. The usual chaos. His laughter filled the space between my husband's anecdotes and my in-laws' nostalgia. I sat across from him and avoided looking directly at him for too long. It was like there was static in the air between us. Nothing visible, nothing said, but it was there, alive and unspoken. Later, back in our room, the quiet was louder than anything I'd heard all day. He changed in the bathroom. I waited until he came out, then I locked myself in and changed, too, taking longer than necessary, folding each item of clothing, fixing my hair pointlessly. When I returned, he was lying on one side of the bed, facing the wall. I slid into the opposite side, my body tense. I lay still, barely breathing, the edge of my hip brushing the mattress divider like it was a moral line. I don't know how long I stayed awake that night. Hours, probably. Every sound, the shifting of blankets, the distant hoot of an owl outside, the occasional turning of his body, made my skin tighten. I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of myself. Afraid of how easily I had stepped into this position without protest. Afraid that something dormant inside me was waking up. In the morning, we dressed in silence. I tried to behave as if everything was normal, joked with the family over breakfast, asked about the hike my mother-in-law wanted to take, held my husband's hand when he offered it. But when my stepbrother passed me the jam, our fingers touched briefly, and my breath caught in my throat. It was just a touch. Accidental. Yet, it lingered like a ghost. That afternoon, the family wanted to explore a trail near the lake. My husband had twisted his ankle slightly the day before and stayed behind. I offered to lead the group, partly to distract myself. The trail was muddy in parts, the smell of pine sharp and cool in the air. I walked ahead with him, faster than the others, telling myself it was coincidence. But when I slipped slightly on a damp rock, it was his hand that steadied me, gripping my arm firmly. We both froze for a second too long. Then he released me. We didn't say anything. The rest of the day passed in fragments, a picnic under trees, laughter echoing down the trail, pictures taken by strangers. But I wasn't really there. I was back on that rock, feeling his fingers on my skin. That night, in bed, I tried to remember the sound of my husband's voice, how it used to calm me when I was younger. But I couldn't hear it clearly anymore. All I could hear was the rhythm of breath next to me. Steady. Deep. Alive. I lay facing the window, back to him. I wondered what he thought of me. If he was uncomfortable. If he noticed the shift between us. If he felt it too. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just circumstance. A room. A bed. An accident. But when I closed my eyes, I didn't see my husband. I saw that frozen moment on the trail, the way my stepbrother's eyes had met mine, unreadable, yet filled with something I dared not name. And I knew then, things were no longer simple. Something had begun. Quietly, dangerously. And I didn't know how to stop it. The second morning felt heavier, like something had shifted in the room during the night while neither of us moved. I woke before the alarm, the air cold against my arms despite the blanket. He was already up, standing near the window with his back to me, arms crossed. I didn't say anything. Just watched his silhouette for a moment, trying to decide whether he felt it too, the weight of what hadn't happened but was dangerously close to unfolding. We joined the rest of the family downstairs. Breakfast was the usual blend of too many voices and clinking plates. My husband, cheerful as always, commented on how well everyone slept. I nodded, pretending I had. My stepbrother sat 2 seats away, focused on his toast, barely speaking. I noticed how he didn't meet my eyes. That fact shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have mattered at all. After breakfast, plans were made for a hike into the forest trail that ran along the east side of the resort. It was something my mother-in-law had found online, a hidden gem, she said, with a twinkle in her eye that only made my stomach tighten. My husband wasn't feeling up to it, said he'd stay back and rest. I considered staying with him, for a moment, but the idea of walking among trees, away from walls and shared beds, was too tempting. So we went here, me, my stepbrother, my in-laws, and 2 of their friends from another cabin. The trail started off broad and sunlit, but the further we walked, the narrower it became. Branches hung low, brushing our shoulders. Roots tangled underfoot. I let the others go ahead and fell into pace beside him. Our steps synchronized naturally, as they always had. Still, we didn't speak. At some point, the others stopped to take photos of a clearing filled with wildflowers. I kept walking. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew he would follow, and he did. When we were far enough from the rest, I stopped. There was a silence between us that felt alive. I turned toward him. He looked at me, really looked, and I felt my breath falter. The sunlight filtered through the trees, painting patterns on his face. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid he could hear it. We didn't plan it. It wasn't romantic or slow. It was just a moment that collapsed under its own weight. We kissed. The second it happened, I pulled away, blinking like I'd been slapped. My fingers rose to my mouth before I could stop them. I shook my head, not at him, but at myself. His face was unreadable, lips parted, chest rising fast. I wanted to say something. I think he did too. But we didn't. Instead, I turned around and started walking back toward the others, faster than I should have, my steps slipping slightly on the damp path. I heard him follow, slower than before. By the time we reached the group again, no one noticed anything. Or they pretended not to. At lunch, I sat beside my husband. He rested a hand on my knee under the table, and I flinched. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone to see. But it was there. That small recoil. That disconnect. I smiled through it, bit into a piece of bread, and laughed at a joke I didn't hear. Back in the room, I went straight to the bathroom, locking the door and turning on the faucet to muffle the sounds. I stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked unchanged, the same lines at the corners of my eyes, the same necklace I always wore. But something underneath had been torn. I didn't cry. There was no drama. Just a hollow throb in my chest that came with knowing I had stepped across a line I couldn't erase. When I came out, he was sitting on the bed, reading. Or pretending to. He didn't look up. I sat at the edge of the chair near the window, hands clasped in my lap. I opened my mouth once, twice, no words came. Later that evening, the family gathered near the fireplace in the lounge. People played cards, shared wine, took turns reminiscing. I watched my husband talking with my father-in-law, laughing, content. He had no idea. No clue that while he slept next to me, I had unraveled miles away in a quiet forest with someone else. My stepbrother sat across the room. Once, our eyes met. Not for long. Just long enough to confirm that yes, it had happened. And neither of us knew what to do now. That night, as we got ready for bed, I moved more deliberately. I folded my clothes neatly, pulled the blanket up to my shoulders, and turned my back to him. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the hallway light slipping in through the crack under the door. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Because now there was no pretending nothing had changed. The morning after the kiss was colder than the days before. Not in temperature, the mountain air remained steady, brisk but not biting, but in the tone of everything around me. The birds still sang from the branches outside our window, but their sound grated against my nerves. I got dressed in silence, moving slowly, careful not to look at him. I could feel him watching me, though he didn't say a word. That silence was starting to feel louder than any argument could. Downstairs, breakfast was in full swing. My husband waved me over to join him and his parents at the corner table, already filled with half-eaten plates of eggs and toast. I smiled automatically, slid into the chair beside him, and picked up my fork. I wasn't hungry. Not even a little. They spoke about the trail plans for the day, something scenic and not too long. I nodded along, even offered to pack snacks for everyone. I kept my tone light, a notch higher than normal, the way I did when I wanted to cover something up. My husband gave my knee a gentle squeeze under the table. I flinched again. Not enough for him to notice, but enough for me to feel disgusted with myself. My stepbrother arrived a few minutes later, his plate already prepared. He sat at the end of the table, beside my mother-in-law. Not beside me. He didn't meet my eyes. I didn't try to meet his either. The entire meal passed like that, words flying over my head, people laughing, planning, enjoying. I sat in the middle of it all, nodding at the right times, pretending not to notice how my hands trembled slightly when I reached for the coffee. Back in the room, I told my husband I felt tired and might stay behind from the hike. He looked at me, concerned. Said I'd seemed quiet. I kissed his cheek and said I just needed a slow day. That was a lie, too. But a harmless one, I told myself. He agreed, kissed my forehead, and left with the others. Once the room was quiet again, I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel the weight of it. The shame, the confusion, the anger at myself. I didn't know how I had ended up here, in this in-between, this place where nothing was technically happening but everything felt dangerously alive. The knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find him standing there, not even pretending to have an excuse. He held a paperback in his hand like it gave him some kind of cover, but we both knew it didn't. I thought you'd gone with them, I said, my voice flatter than I intended. I needed air, he replied, then held up the book. And quiet. I stepped aside without speaking and let him in. He sat in the chair by the window, the one I'd used the night before, and opened the book. I watched him for a moment, then sat on the bed, facing away. We stayed like that for a long time. Two people in the same room, separated by more than just furniture. I stared at the window, watched clouds drift past the mountaintops, listened to the faint rustle of a turned page every few minutes. Finally, I broke the silence. I can't act like it didn't happen. He didn't respond right away. I turned to look at him. He hadn't moved. It wasn't supposed to happen, I said. I know, he said quietly. I'm married. I know. The words felt useless, like broken pieces of something that couldn't be put back together. I stood up, walked to the window, pressed my forehead against the cold glass. My reflection stared back, a woman who looked calm, composed, even serene. But inside, I was unraveling. He put the book down, slowly. His voice was softer when he spoke again. It wasn't just you. I didn't plan it either. But it happened. I nodded. That was the problem. It had happened. And no matter how still we sat now, the air between us had changed forever. Eventually, he left. Said he'd join the others at the trailhead after all. I watched him go, the door clicking shut behind him like the final note of a song I never wanted to hear again. I spent the rest of the day wandering the grounds alone. I walked past the pond where children threw breadcrumbs to ducks. I sat on a bench near the edge of the trail, watching the trees sway. I tried to feel peaceful, centered. But all I felt was trapped. That evening, back in the room, I showered before dinner. Took my time. Washed my hair twice. Scrubbed my skin until it tingled. I thought the heat and water might erase something, wash away the mistake. It didn't. Dinner was loud again, and I played my part. I smiled. I passed salt. I asked my father-in-law about his photography. My husband touched my arm when he laughed. I laughed, too. My stepbrother sat directly across the table. We didn't speak. Not once. But our silence was different now, more deliberate, more defensive. When we returned to the room, my husband was tired. He lay on the bed, flipped through channels for a while, and then turned off the TV. You okay? He asked, already half asleep. Just tired, I said. He kissed my shoulder and turned over. Within minutes, he was breathing deeply. I lay on my back, eyes open in the dark, listening to the quiet. And for the first time, I didn't want to sleep. Because in sleep, there were dreams. And lately, I was starting to fear what those dreams might show me. The next morning began the same as the one before, cold air, the faint creak of floorboards, and that quiet hesitation between opening my eyes and facing the weight of reality. I didn't want to move. If I could have frozen time, stayed under the covers in some stasis of denial, I would have. But the day waited, and with it, the same people, the same dynamic, the same silent storm inside me that had only grown stronger. He was already up and gone by the time I rose. His side of the bed was neatly arranged, his towel missing from the bathroom rack. I stood in front of the sink brushing my teeth, trying not to think about what it meant, his avoidance, his presence, his silence. Trying and failing. I joined the rest of the family on the terrace for coffee. The sun had finally come out in full, casting golden light over the pine trees that circled the resort. Everyone seemed in better spirits, maybe it was the fresh air, maybe the promise of a new trail to explore. My husband greeted me with a warm smile and an arm around my shoulder. I leaned into it just enough to play the part, though my spine never fully relaxed. We spent the morning walking through the town. The small shops were quaint and colorful, lined with carved wooden signs and displays of local honey, handmade soaps, and too many postcards we'd never send. My mother-in-law asked me to help her pick out souvenirs for her friends. I obliged, keeping my hands busy and my thoughts focused on the price tags. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a rack of scarves, running my fingers over the soft fabrics, when I caught sight of him a few feet away. He was holding a small carved figurine, turning it in his hands, pretending to inspect it. But his eyes flicked toward me for a split second. A silent glance. Not even a full second. But it knocked the air out of me. I turned away quickly, pretending to look at something else. My husband called my name from across the shop, asking if I wanted to grab lunch. I nodded, grateful for the interruption. We ate outside at a rustic little cafe with mismatched chairs and wildflowers in jars on the tables. I barely touched my food. My appetite had become something theoretical, a function I pretended to have. I sipped at my drink and responded to the conversation with half smiles and well-timed nods. After lunch, everyone wanted to go back to the resort to rest before dinner. My husband offered to take a nap, but I needed to move. I told him I'd walk a bit, stretch my legs. He didn't question it, just kissed me on the cheek and headed upstairs. I took the trail behind the hotel that led toward the trees. The same one we'd all used on the first day. I wasn't sure why I went there. I didn't have a destination. I just knew I needed to be somewhere else, somewhere that didn't feel like a stage where I had to play a role I no longer recognized. The trees welcomed me with silence. I walked slowly, letting my mind wander where it wanted. At some point, I sat on a fallen log near a clearing, letting my feet rest. I didn't hear him approaching, but I wasn't surprised when I looked up and saw him there, a few yards away. He stopped walking as soon as our eyes met. Neither of us moved. "I didn't follow you," he said after a beat. His voice was calm, neutral, but it cracked slightly on the last word. "I know," I replied. My voice came out quieter than I intended. He stepped closer, slowly, but didn't sit. He kept a respectful distance, as if we were two strangers who knew too much about each other. We stayed like that for several minutes. I looked down at the pine needles scattered at my feet, watching how they overlapped like memories. Tangled, dry, fragile. "I shouldn't have kissed you," I said finally. "I know," he answered again. "But I did too." That was the thing. Neither of us could pretend anymore that it had been one-sided, or spontaneous, or accidental. We had both been there. We had both felt it. "It doesn't matter anymore," I added, standing up and brushing the dirt off my coat. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But he didn't. He just nodded. We walked back to the resort separately. That evening, there was an organized group event at the lounge, trivia night or something similar. My husband was excited about it, pulling me into the group, handing me a pen and scorecard. I sat next to him, tried to laugh when everyone else did, scribbled answers even when I didn't know the questions. My body was there, my smile was present, but my mind hovered in the space between two wrong turns. At one point, he sat across the room, reading something on his phone. I allowed myself to look at him longer than I should have. His posture, the curve of his neck, the calm in his face. It struck me how familiar he had become to me, not just physically, but in rhythm. I knew when he was about to speak. I could predict when he'd shift his gaze. And yet, I didn't know what to do with this knowledge anymore. Back in our room, I showered in silence, the water echoing against the tiles like whispers I couldn't interpret. I stayed under the stream longer than usual, my fingers pruning, my mind spinning. When I came out, he was already in bed, reading under the soft glow of the nightstand lamp. He looked up as I walked past, then quickly back down. I slipped under the covers, careful to stay on my side. The light clicked off. Darkness settled in. For a long while, there was nothing but breathing. I listened to the pattern of his slow, deep, unfazed, and tried to sync my own. I didn't move. He didn't either. That night, I didn't dream. Or maybe I did and just couldn't remember. All I know is that when I opened my eyes in the middle of the night, he was turned the other way, his back to me, and I felt relief. Because I wasn't ready for another moment I couldn't undo. The day began with a strange stillness, as if everything around us had paused. I woke up before sunrise, the faintest hint of blue filtering in through the curtains. My husband was still sleeping, curled slightly toward the edge of the bed, one arm tucked beneath his pillow. I watched him for a few moments. There was a kind of innocence to him when he slept, one I had forgotten existed. In that moment, I wished I could go back to a time when my thoughts didn't fracture under the weight of guilt. I got dressed quietly and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp, crisp, and biting in the best way. It reminded me I was alive, even if I didn't feel like it inside. I walked through the garden that circled the property, following the cobblestone path that led to a small bench at the edge of the clearing. No one was around. Just the rustling of leaves and the soft hum of something unnamed inside me. He found me there. I don't know how he knew I'd be here, but part of me wasn't surprised. We were beginning to move like echoes of each other, drawn toward the same silences. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat on the opposite end of the bench, hands in his pockets, his gaze somewhere in the distance. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. My body was still. But inside, everything churned. I wasn't going to come, he said eventually, voice low. I wasn't waiting, I replied, almost instantly. It wasn't meant to sound cold, but it did. Maybe that was necessary. There was a long pause. And then, without another word, he stood up, walked a few steps away, and turned back toward me. His face was unreadable, but his hands were clenched. I could see the tension in the way his shoulders curved. I followed him. I don't know why. Maybe it was easier than resisting again. We walked back to the building in silence. The hallway was empty. Most guests were still asleep or slow to stir. The corridor stretched ahead like a line we weren't supposed to cross, and yet we already had. We kissed. No words. No explanation. No apology. We kissed. When I pulled back, there was no shock, no recoil. Just breath. Just silence. I stepped away, my heart pounding too loudly in my chest. I didn't know if he would say something, if I wanted him to. But neither of us spoke. I turned and walked toward my room, each step a strange blend of weight and release. Inside, my husband had just gotten up. He was brushing his teeth, humming softly under his breath. When he saw me, he smiled through the mirror. I smiled back, mechanically, and walked to the window. I watched the sun begin to rise behind the trees, watched the light spill over the gravel and the branches and the still wet leaves. I kept my back to the room, pretending to be absorbed in the view. I heard him come up behind me, his hand grazing my back gently before moving to my shoulder. "Beautiful morning," he said, and I nodded. Later, we joined the rest of the family for breakfast. I sat next to him, poured coffee, buttered toast. Across the table, my stepbrother never looked at me. He laughed at a joke someone made. He complimented the scrambled eggs. He wore the same calm face he always did, but something in his stillness made it all feel like a performance. I played along, too. I always had. After breakfast, the group decided to go into town again. I begged off. Said I had a headache, too much sun maybe. My husband offered to stay behind, but I insisted he go. He hesitated for a moment, then kissed my forehead and left with the others. Alone in the room, I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. I tried to focus on the pattern of the rug, the texture of the blanket, the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Anything but the noise in my head. Hours passed slowly. I didn't move much. Just breathed. Just existed. When they returned, the atmosphere had shifted again. Everyone was more subdued, more tired, or maybe that was just my perception. My husband brought me a small bag from one of the stores, a bracelet, delicate and simple. He said it reminded him of something I would have worn years ago. I smiled, thanked him, and clasped it around my wrist. It fit perfectly. But it felt like a weight, not a gift. That night, we had dinner on the terrace. String lights glowed softly above us. The food was good, the wine warm. Laughter drifted across the tables like music, soft and scattered. I laughed, too. I tilted my head at the right moments, touched my husband's hand when he leaned in close. My stepbrother sat at the other end of the table. I could see him, feel him, but we didn't acknowledge each other. When we returned to our room, I undressed slowly. Folded my clothes. Removed my jewelry. I paused at the bracelet and left it on. It didn't feel right to take it off. My husband turned on the bedside lamp and read for a while. I pretended to read too, holding a book but not seeing the words. Eventually, he set his down and reached for me. We kissed. His lips were warm, familiar, certain. I closed my eyes and let him hold me. But somewhere deep inside, a fracture had formed. And no matter how close we lay that night, I knew something had changed that couldn't be undone. The next morning felt like waking into someone else's life. The bed was warm, the room quiet, and for a few seconds, I forgot where I was. I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine how things might have felt if nothing had happened. If we had simply been family, sharing a space, enjoying the mountains, returning home with shared memories and nothing to hide. But that wasn't reality. Not anymore. My husband was already up, humming lightly in the bathroom, the sound of water running under his soft tune. I got dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, almost mechanical. I chose a sweater I hadn't worn yet on this trip, navy blue, soft and oversized, hoping it would feel like armor. It didn't. At breakfast, the mood among the family had shifted again, though subtly. My mother-in-law chatted about hiking options, her energy bright and persistent. My father-in-law skimmed a newspaper, muttering commentary between bites of toast. My husband was relaxed, scrolling through his phone, occasionally passing it to me with photos from the day before, smiling faces, mountain views, candid laughter. I smiled. I nodded. I said the right things. I don't remember any of them. Across the table, my stepbrother ate quietly, his posture a touch more rigid than usual. He didn't glance in my direction, but I felt his awareness of me like static in the air. Our proximity wasn't the issue anymore, it was the effort to appear indifferent, the exhausting discipline of ignoring the weight between us. After breakfast, we were encouraged to join a group trail walk organized by the resort. It was meant to be a light activity, a casual hike with a guide, nothing strenuous. My husband nudged me gently and whispered, "Let's go. It might help your headache." I nodded. Not because I wanted to, but because saying no would draw attention. The trail looped around the lower slopes of the mountain, weaving through pine trees and the occasional open patch where the sun reached the ground in golden pools. The guide was friendly and talkative, pointing out various herbs, telling stories about the history of the land. I barely listened. I walked beside my husband, but my mind was behind me, focused on the rhythm of footsteps that matched mine a few paces away. About halfway through the loop, we paused at a small rest area near a stream. Benches were set out in a half-circle, and a few people wandered off to take photos. My husband went to help his mother adjust her camera. I stayed back, pretending to stretch, pretending to breathe evenly. I turned my head slightly and found him there, not looking at me, but close. Not speaking. Just being. I didn't move. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a bottle of water, held it toward me. I took it. Our fingers touched for a second too long. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even obvious. But it was enough. I turned away quickly, walking toward the stream, letting the sound of water fill the space where words should have been. The guide eventually gathered us, and we finished the hike in near silence. My husband walked beside me again, humming a tune I didn't recognize, occasionally pointing out a tree or a view. I responded on cue, said "That's beautiful," when he said, "Look at that." But the voice I used didn't feel like mine. Back at the resort, we returned to our room for a short rest before dinner. My husband lay on the bed with his eyes closed, one arm over his forehead. I sat in the chair by the window, pulling the curtain aside with 2 fingers and staring out into the courtyard below. 2 children were playing near the fountain, chasing a red ball that kept rolling just out of reach. Their laughter echoed faintly through the open window, carefree and bright, like a song from another lifetime. I heard the soft click of our door opening. I turned reflexively, but it wasn't anyone entering, just the wind pulling it gently as it hadn't latched properly. I got up, closed it, and stood there for a moment, hand on the handle, heartbeat loud in my chest. Later that evening, we had a quiet family dinner in the main dining hall. The lights were dimmed, the windows reflecting the darkening sky. The food was good, roast vegetables, baked fish, warm bread, but I tasted none of it. My husband was animated again, telling a story about his college days. The others listened with varying degrees of interest. I watched him as he spoke, observed how he gestured with his hands, how the lines near his eyes deepened when he smiled. He was a good man. Steady. Kind. Reliable. And yet, I sat there, across from the very person I had been loyal to for years, knowing that a part of me had already left. After dessert, the group moved to the lounge for card games. I excused myself early, said I needed to rest. No one questioned it. I walked back to the room alone, my steps slow, as if the hallway itself might offer some kind of answer if I gave it enough time. Inside, I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the soft hum of the heater, the occasional creak of wood, the pulse in my throat. I opened the window halfway, letting in the cool night air. It smelled like pine and earth, sharp and grounding. When I heard the knock, I already knew who it was. I didn't move. I didn't speak. It didn't come again. He left. And I sat in that room, hands folded in my lap, eyes focused on nothing. I stayed that way for a long time, until I heard the footsteps of my husband returning, cheerful and light, carrying the scent of wine and firewood. He stepped inside, smiled, said something about how everyone missed me during the game. I nodded, smiled faintly, and said I'd felt better resting. He kissed the top of my head, then disappeared into the bathroom. I lay down fully clothed, my body heavy with a sadness I didn't have the words for. Because nothing had happened that night. And yet, everything had. The morning began with rain. Not a soft, cleansing drizzle, but a dense, persistent kind that blurred the mountains and soaked the stones of the terrace outside our window. I woke to the sound of it tapping against the glass, a steady rhythm that mirrored the pulsing in my head. My husband was already dressed, standing near the window, sipping coffee from the paper cup he must have brought back from the lobby. I sat up slowly, my limbs heavy, as if sleep had not refreshed me but added weight. He turned to me with a smile, one that came easily to his face, unaffected by the things stirring beneath the surface of mine. He said we should take advantage of the storm and stay in, just us. Watch a movie. Order room service. A slow, quiet day. I nodded, not trusting my voice. My mind felt slippery, ungraspable. Part of me longed for that version of the day, uncomplicated, safe, clean. Another part already knew it would not unfold that way. We watched half of a film, something light-hearted and forgettable. I don't remember the plot. I sat beside him on the bed, my body angled slightly away, my focus flickering between the screen and the rain. He wrapped his arm around my shoulder, and I leaned into him, because I always had. Because my body knew how to perform comfort even when my mind was elsewhere. Around noon, the weather shifted slightly. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the sky still overcast but no longer hostile. The others were gathering in the lounge for games and coffee, but I told my husband I wanted to take a walk alone, just around the grounds, to clear my head. He hesitated but didn't press. He kissed my temple and reminded me to take an umbrella. I took one and left, stepping into the mist with no plan but movement. The world was quiet. The paths were mostly empty, save for the occasional rustle of wind through wet leaves. I walked without direction, following the curve of the trail around the resort, boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. The solitude was a balm and a burden. I didn't expect to see him again. Not that soon. But I did. He was seated on the bench near the far edge of the grounds, the same one where we'd sat days ago, where so many things had begun to fracture. His coat was damp around the edges. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. I could have walked away. Should have, perhaps. But my legs carried me forward before I made a decision. I sat beside him. Not close, not distant. The air between us was charged and quiet. We didn't speak for a while. The rain continued lightly, a fine mist settling into the folds of our clothing. From the path behind us, a faint murmur of laughter echoed, distant enough to ignore, close enough to remind us of everything we weren't supposed to feel. I thought you were with them, I said eventually. I was, he replied. Needed air. That phrase again. Always air. As if breathing in solitude would somehow fix the parts of us that had cracked. We looked forward, not at each other. My hands rested on my knees. His were clasped between his thighs. I don't know what happens now, I admitted. Neither do I. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a promise. It was simply the truth, the only thing we had that didn't feel like a performance. A gust of wind picked up, pulling strands of my hair across my face. He reached out, almost on reflex, brushing them back. His fingers grazed my cheek, light and careful, like touching glass. I didn't flinch. But I didn't lean in either. I turned my head slowly, looking at him for the first time in what felt like days. His eyes were steady, but tired. There was no heat, no pleading. Just recognition. Like he saw me in a way I hadn't let myself be seen in years. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered. "No," he said. "We can't." He stood first. I followed. We walked back together but didn't arrive together. At the curve in the path, where the trees opened into the courtyard, we split off silently, each taking a different side. I re-entered through the west wing, circling back to the room. When I walked in, my husband was flipping through channels again, the remote in one hand, a cup of tea in the other. "Feel better?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied. The air helped. He smiled, pleased, and returned his gaze to the screen. I changed into dry clothes, moved through the room like a guest, like someone playing a version of herself. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. But inside, there was a hollow ache I couldn't name. Later that night, we were invited to a family dinner in the main hall. A special meal for guests, with live music and shared desserts. We dressed for it, him in a collared shirt, me in a simple dress I hadn't worn since the trip began. I looked in the mirror before we left and saw a woman who resembled me but felt like a stranger. The room was warm and full. Candles on every table, the low murmur of conversation beneath a soft guitar. I sat between my husband and his mother, nodded at stories, took small bites of food I couldn't taste. Across the room, he was seated with the younger guests, laughing lightly, his face composed. Once, our eyes met. Briefly. Not in longing. Not in guilt. Just acknowledgement. We were two people who had shared something they couldn't explain and couldn't continue. When the music swelled, my husband asked me to dance. I said yes. We moved slowly, clumsily, his hand warm against my back. I let him lead. I always had. But in my mind, I was still walking the trail. Still sitting in silence. Still feeling that soft, brief touch against my cheek like a question I hadn't answered. And when we returned to our room that night, when he curled beside me and whispered that he was glad I'd come on the trip, I whispered back that I was too. Because by now, I had learned how to lie in the language of softness. And I had become very, very good at it. The final morning at the resort began with an unusual quiet, not from the world outside, but within me. It wasn't peace, I wasn't naive enough to believe in that, but more like an emotional stillness, as if everything that could have swirled already had, and now the air had settled. The rain had stopped sometime during the night. The clouds remained low and gray, but the heaviness of the storm was gone. There was dew on the windowsill, and the pine trees beyond stood tall and unmoved. I got dressed before my husband stirred. I moved gently around the room, folding clothes into my suitcase, checking drawers, pretending to focus on tasks as if they were decisions. I didn't want to rush. I didn't want to linger. Mostly, I didn't want to speak. When he woke up, he looked rested and content, stretching with a satisfied sigh before reaching for his phone. I offered a small smile. He told me we had plenty of time before checkout, that breakfast was still open, and maybe we could take one last family photo in front of the fountain. I said that sounded nice. I used the tone that fit the role, pleasant, agreeable, rehearsed. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with the quiet commotion of people preparing to leave. Suitcases rolled across stone tiles. Children whined about the end of vacation. Staff moved efficiently between desks. My mother-in-law was already at the table, sipping tea, her overnight bag neatly beside her. My stepbrother joined shortly after. He wore a dark sweater and carried a folded rain jacket under one arm. He sat across from me. Not beside. Not diagonally. Directly across. The space between us on the table felt both impossibly narrow and endlessly wide. I forced my eyes to stay on my coffee cup. My husband chatted beside me, talking about how he'd like to return during the spring when the trails weren't so muddy. I nodded, said something like, "That would be lovely," while stirring sugar into a drink I wouldn't finish. No one commented on how quiet I'd become. Or if they noticed, they didn't say. After breakfast, we took the photo. Everyone lined up in front of the fountain, arms around one another, smiling for the timer on the phone propped up by a rock. I stood between my husband and my mother-in-law. My stepbrother stood slightly to the side. The camera flashed. The moment was captured. The version of us we wanted to preserve was printed in pixels before the truth could spill between the lines. I stepped away first. My husband reached for my hand, and I took it. Out of habit. Out of duty. Out of not knowing what else to do. The plan was to caravan back together, but we all had different schedules. My in-laws would take their own route. My husband offered to drive most of the way so I could relax. I agreed, already bracing myself for the hours of close proximity and light conversation. I didn't dread his company, I dreaded the effort it would take to keep pretending. While we waited near the cars, I realized I had forgotten my phone charger inside the room. I told my husband I'd be quick and jogged back toward the entrance. The elevator was slow, so I took the stairs. Halfway up the hallway, I saw him. Alone. Coming from the opposite direction. We didn't stop walking. We passed each other with no words, no nods, not even a glance. But as our shoulders nearly brushed, I felt it, the weight of everything unspoken pressing between us like a closed door we'd both leaned against from opposite sides. Back in the room, I stood for longer than I needed to. The charger was in plain sight. I held it in my hand but didn't move. The window was open slightly from earlier, letting in a faint breeze that stirred the curtain. I looked out at the clearing below. 2 children were playing near the benches, their coats unzipped and flapping as they ran. In the distance, I saw him again. Alone. Walking toward the woods behind the property. And for 1 second, my body moved forward, as if it could follow without my mind's permission. But I stopped. I didn't go after him. Not because I didn't want to. But because I couldn't afford to want anymore. I turned away from the window and walked back down to the car, holding the charger like it anchored me. My husband greeted me with a smile. We packed the final bags into the trunk, exchanged goodbyes with the others, and pulled out of the lot. I didn't look back. The drive was long. Trees blurred past the windows, and my husband spoke gently about work and dinner plans and whether we should invite our friends over next weekend. I responded where expected, filling the silence with practiced ease. But inside, I felt hollow. Not in a tragic way. Not like something had been stolen. More like something had been used up. I thought about how a single moment can pull you out of your own life and show you what was always missing. And once you've seen that, once you've stepped into the space that used to be only fantasy, you can't return unchanged. Even if nothing ever happens again. Even if no one ever finds out. Later, after the traffic had eased and we were nearly home, my husband reached over and touched my knee. "I'm glad we went," he said. "Me too," I replied. He didn't know what I meant. And maybe I didn't either. But I meant it. In a way I couldn't explain. Returning home was quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic shift, no emotional unraveling. The bags were unpacked, laundry sorted, the refrigerator restocked with familiar things. Our house, with its worn wood floors and framed photos on the shelves, accepted us back without protest. Everything looked exactly the same. But I wasn't. The trip had left something in me unsettled, something I carried like a thin layer of dust that no amount of washing could remove. I moved through the days efficiently, answering emails, grocery shopping, going through mail. My husband returned to his routine with practiced ease, catching up with colleagues, suggesting takeout on the nights we didn't feel like cooking. He told me he missed our bed while we were away. I smiled and agreed. We talked more than usual. Not deeply, just the kind of conversation that fills space, schedules, errands, the state of the garden. In a way, it should have felt like reconnection. But it felt more like maintenance. That following weekend, we attended a dinner party hosted by friends. 8 of us at a long table, wine glasses clinking, candles flickering. Laughter rising and falling like music. I wore a dress I hadn't worn in years, black with a simple neckline. My husband complimented me before we left. He said I looked beautiful. I thanked him. It was the first time in a long time I noticed his eyes linger on me. At the party, someone asked about our trip. My husband described the landscape, the food, the charming absurdity of the double-booked room. Everyone laughed when he said I'd been such a good sport about sharing space. I laughed too. I was getting very good at that. One of the guests asked if we'd go back. I answered before my husband could. Probably not. Once was enough. There was nothing in my tone to raise suspicion. But inside, I felt the weight of my own words. Once had been more than enough. That night, after we came home, I stood at the kitchen sink and stared out the window. The porch light cast a circle of brightness on the grass, and just beyond it, the yard faded into shadow. I stood there a long time, fingers curled around the edge of the counter, breathing through the silence. Upstairs, I heard him getting ready for bed. Drawers opening. Water running. The click of the bathroom light. The ordinary sounds of a life continuing as if nothing had changed. I went up after a while. I lay beside him in bed and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. The next morning, I received a message. It was brief. Neutral. His name on my screen was enough to stop my breath. I hadn't heard from him since the resort. The message only said, "I hope you're okay." That was all. No question. No invitation. Just a sentence. I didn't respond immediately. I placed the phone face down on the table and stared at the wall. The walls of our home felt suddenly unfamiliar, like a shell I was wearing too tightly. Everything that had been comforting, the framed photos, the soft throw on the couch, the ticking clock in the hallway, felt distant. Hours later, I wrote back. "I'm fine. I hope you are too." And that was it. There were no more messages. In the days that followed, I returned to routine. We hosted my husband's parents for brunch. I met a friend for coffee. I sat through a community board meeting and took notes like I cared about zoning revisions. My life, the one I had built over decades, resumed its place around me like an outfit I had outgrown but couldn't discard. One night, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the scarf I wore on our last hike. It still smelled faintly of pine and rain. I held it for a long time, pressing the fabric between my fingers, remembering the way the wind had lifted it behind me, the way I hadn't wanted to come back down the mountain. I folded it carefully and placed it in the back of the drawer. That weekend, my husband suggested we take a short trip, just the two of us, maybe to the coast. I agreed without hesitation. A different landscape. A chance to move forward. He was trying, in his way. I owed him that. We drove for hours along the water. The waves rolled in quietly beside the highway, steady and indifferent. We checked into a small inn by the cliffs, unpacked our things, and took a walk before dinner. He held my hand as we walked. I let him. His fingers were warm, familiar, good. We didn't talk about anything important. And for the first time, that felt okay. That night, I stood on the balcony and watched the horizon dissolve into the dark. The air smelled of salt and distance. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just stood there, feeling the quiet inside me settle. The truth of what happened in the mountains had become something else. Not a story. Not a memory. A shift. A pivot. A reminder that we live in proximity to choices all the time, some we take, some we resist, some that rewrite us even in silence. And maybe, I thought, that was the real change. Not what we did, but who we became when we returned. When I climbed back into bed that night, I turned toward my husband. He was already asleep, breathing softly. I touched his arm lightly, then rested my head on the pillow beside him. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the waves carry me somewhere in between forgetting and remembering. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere honest. A full month had passed since the trip, though in my mind, it felt like a fragment of time both distant and ongoing. The days had taken on a new rhythm, steady, tolerable, yet laced with something that couldn't be named aloud. Not regret exactly. Not longing either. More like a quiet awareness that nothing had really returned to the way it was, even if everything around me appeared intact. Mornings resumed their familiar shape. My husband read the news on his tablet while I prepared coffee, the two of us moving around the kitchen like clock hands rotating in known patterns. We talked about errands, the weather, weekend invitations. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we didn't. There was nothing wrong. And that, perhaps, was the hardest part. I found myself growing quieter. Not deliberately, but gradually, the way a river slows under ice. I smiled when expected. I kissed him goodnight. I sat beside him at dinners and remembered to ask about his meetings. I wasn't acting. I wasn't pretending. But I wasn't fully present either. One Saturday morning, I woke early. The light outside was soft, the kind that presses gently against the windowpane before fully entering. My husband was still sleeping, his breathing slow and even. I slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, barefoot, careful not to wake him. In the kitchen, I stood at the counter with my cup of tea, staring at the ceramic backsplash. I noticed a crack running along one tile that I'd never seen before. It wasn't large. It didn't need fixing. But it caught my eye, like a quiet truth that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Later that day, we visited the local market. He picked out tomatoes. I chose bread. We bought flowers for the table, a bunch of soft white lilies. I placed them in a tall glass vase when we returned home, arranging them with more attention than necessary. Their scent filled the dining room with something gentle and clean. That evening, we had friends over. 4 people, simple food, a few bottles of wine. Laughter floated through the rooms again. Stories were told and retold. I laughed when they did, poured drinks, cleared dishes, offered dessert. I watched myself from the outside, wondering if anyone could see how easily I could disappear into the role. After everyone had gone, and the last of the dishes were stacked neatly beside the sink, I stood alone in the living room for a while. My husband had gone upstairs. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. On the coffee table sat an unopened envelope, one of many we had set aside earlier, addressed to both of us from a family friend. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, then set it back down. It wasn't important. It could wait. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark except for the sliver of light coming from under the bedroom door. I paused for a moment before entering, letting my hand rest on the knob, not in hesitation, but in stillness. Inside, he was reading. He looked up when I entered, offered a warm smile, then went back to his book. I changed into my nightclothes, brushed my hair, washed my face. Routine. When I slipped under the covers, the bed was warm. He reached for my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. I returned the pressure. After a few minutes, he set his book down and turned off the light. In the darkness, I stared at the ceiling. I thought about the scarf I had hidden away, still faintly scented with pine. I thought about the walk through the trees, the moments of silence that had said more than any confession could. I thought about the versions of myself that had emerged in that mountain air, one that was real, raw, frightening, honest. I thought about the man beside me, his steadiness, his kindness, his belief in the life we had built. And I thought about the truth that lived quietly between the moments of my day now, not loud or damning, but constant. A shift. A weight. A knowledge. I didn't want to destroy anything. I didn't want chaos. But I didn't want to disappear either. The next morning, I sat down at my desk after breakfast, opened my laptop, and began to write. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a letter. It was more like a journal entry, though I knew I wouldn't keep it. I wrote about the mountain. About the silence. About the bench where nothing and everything happened. I wrote about how I had looked in the mirror and seen someone I hadn't met in years. Not someone new, but someone I'd forgotten. I didn't write about guilt. That word didn't fit. I wrote about distance. About proximity. About choice. When I finished, I didn't read it over. I didn't delete it either. I saved the document, titled it something nondescript, and closed the laptop. I didn't know if I would open it again. I didn't know if someday I would need it. That night, I placed the lilies in the center of the dining table. Their petals were beginning to wilt at the edges, curling softly. My husband walked past and brushed a hand over my back, casual, familiar. I stood there a moment longer, watching the flowers. Then I turned off the light and went upstairs.